Chapter 51. Henry IV of Bolingbroke. The story of the Battle of Shrewsbury. Henry IV knew quite well that he was not the real heir to the throne, although he tried to make people believe that he was. The real heir was Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March. Richard II was the son of Edward the Black Prince, who was the eldest son of Edward III. Edmund Mortimer was descended from Lionel of Clarence, who was the third son of Edward III. Henry Bolingbroke was descended from John of Gaunt, who was the fourth son of Edward III. So, of course, Edmund Mortimer had a better right to the throne than Henry Bolingbroke had. But Edmund Mortimer was only a little boy, and, like so many other little princes, he was passed over and forgotten. The people chose rather to have a strong man who could really rule than a little boy who could rule only in name. But Henry was afraid of Edmund, and kept him a prisoner in Windsor Castle, although he was not otherwise unkind to him. Henry had seized the throne in an unlawful manner, and he found that it was no easy matter to keep it. No sooner was he crowned than plots thickened around him, and people who had hated Richard were now sorry that they had put Henry on the throne. The Welsh, who had been conquered by Edward I, had never been content to live under the rule of English kings, and Owen Glendower, a Welsh nobleman, now rebelled against Henry. He called himself the Prince of Wales, claiming to be descended from Llewellyn, that Welsh prince whom Edward I had defeated and killed. Nearly all Wales joined Owen Glendower, and although Henry went against them with a large army, he was not able to subdue them. The Welsh took several of Henry's nobles prisoner, among them Sir Edmund Mortimer. This Sir Edmund was an uncle of the young Earl of March, whom Henry kept in prison at Windsor. Henry was quite pleased that Sir Edmund should be a captive, because he was afraid that he might at some time try to put his nephew on the throne. The Scots had meanwhile also been fighting with the English, and had been defeated by the Earl of Northumberland and his young son, who was called Harry Hotspur. He was called Hotspur because he was so quick and brave in battle. Harry Hotspur and his father had taken the Scottish leader Douglas prisoner. They expected to get a large ransom from the Scots for him, but Henry said that Douglas must be given up to him. This made the Percys, as Harry Hotspur and his father were called, very angry. They thought that, as they had taken Douglas prisoner, they had a right to the money which would be paid for his release. The Percys then asked Henry to send money to Owen Glendower to ransom Edmund Mortimer, for Edmund was Harry Hotspur's dear friend. But Henry refused. He did not wish Edmund to be free because he was afraid of him. This refusal made the Percys still more angry. The Percys had helped to put Henry on the throne, but now they became so angry with him that they were sorry that they had done so, and they turned against him. Instead of giving up Douglas to Henry, the Percys set him free, on condition that he should help them to fight against the king. They made friends with Owen Glendower, who set Edmund Mortimer free, and persuaded him also to join them against Henry. When the king heard of this great rebellion, he marched with a large army to Shrewsbury, and there he defeated the Percys before Owen Glendower could come with his soldiers to their help. King Henry had been told that some of the rebel nobles had sworn to kill him, so he went into battle in plain armor, while 4 or 5 knights went dressed like the king. These knights were all killed, Douglas himself killing 3 of them. "I marvel to see so many kings rise thus one after the other," he said. "I have this day slain 3. But the real king was not among them, although he was in the battle fighting bravely. The Prince of Wales, or Prince Hal, as he was often called, was only a boy, but he did great deeds at this battle, and even when he had been badly wounded, he would not leave the field until victory for his father was sure. Harry Hotspur was killed, Douglas taken prisoner, and so with this one battle the rebellion was almost at an end. Henry next marched against Owen Glendower, but still he could not subdue him. Owen fought against Henry all his life, and at last died among the lonely mountains of Wales, still free and still unconquered. Henry IV had a very unquiet reign. He was in constant fear of rebellion in England, and besides the Welsh, the Scots and the French were always fighting with him. But a great misfortune fell upon the Scottish king, which forced him to make peace with Henry. The Scots and the French had always been good friends, and now King Robert III sent his little son James to France to learn French. But while on his way there his ship was captured by the English, and Prince James, who was only 9 years old, was taken a prisoner to London. Henry was very glad to have Prince James in his power, for the Scots were now afraid to fight against him in case he should do some harm to their little prince. "If the Scots had been kind," said Henry, "they would have sent their prince to me. I could teach him the French language as well as any Frenchman." When the King of Scotland heard that his son had fallen into the hands of his enemy, he was so sad and afraid that he died of a broken heart. The king's brother, the Duke of Albany, wanted to rule Scotland himself, so he was pleased that James was a prisoner, and did not try to make Henry set him free. Although King Henry kept Prince James in prison, he allowed him to have books and teachers, who taught him many things which were afterwards useful to him, and helped him to become a good king. He also wrote some very beautiful poetry while he was in prison, so those years were not altogether lost. End of chapter 51. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on July 12th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 52. Henry IV of Bolingbroke. The story of how Prince Hal was sent to prison. Prince Hal was clever and brave, but he was so wild and fond of fun that he was called Madcap Hal. He spent a great deal of time with gay companions, and often got into mischief. One day a servant of Prince Hal, having done something wicked, was taken before the Lord Chief Justice Gascoigne to be tried and punished. When Prince Hal heard about it he was very angry, and went at once to the courthouse. He strode up to where his servant was standing, and, turning to the officer beside him, "Take off those fetters," he said. "Let my man go free. How dare you arrest my servant?" "My lord Prince," said Judge Gascoigne calmly, "your servant has broken the law, and must be punished by the law. If you wish to save him, you must go to the king your father, and beg mercy from him. He can grant it if he thinks fit. Now I pray you leave the court, and allow me to deal as I think just with the prisoner." Prince Hal was very angry at being spoken to like this. He was so angry that he hardly knew what he was doing, and, springing forward, he struck the judge in the face. The people in the court were dumb with astonishment and fear. What would happen next, no one knew. The prince was in such a passion that they were afraid he might kill the judge. But Judge Gascoigne sat quite still and unmoved. "Sir," he said sternly to the prince, "remember that I am here in place of the king, your lord and father. In his name I charge you to give up your sword. For your contempt and disobedience I send you to prison. There you shall remain until the will of the king your father shall be known." At these calm, grave words the prince was ashamed. All his anger vanished, and, taking off his sword, he bowed humbly to the judge and went quietly to prison. As soon as the prince had gone, some of his servants ran to tell the king what had happened. They expected him to be very angry with the judge. But after hearing the story, the king sat silent for a few minutes. Then he said, "I thank God that he has given me a judge who does not fear to do justice, and a son who can obey the law." Towards the end of his troubled reign, Henry IV was often ill, and although very unwilling to do so, he was obliged to allow Prince Hal to help in ruling the kingdom. Once, while the king was ill, Prince Hal came into his room, and finding him lying very still and quiet, thought that he was dead. The crown was beside the king's bed, and the prince lifted it, put it on his own head, and went away. But the king was not dead, and when he awoke and found that the crown was gone, he was greatly alarmed. He called to his nobles who were in a room near. "Why have you left me alone? Someone has stolen the crown." The nobles came running to the king. "The prince was with you, my lord, while you slept," they said. "He must have taken the crown." "The prince took it," said the king. "Go, bring him here." When he was told that the king was not dead, Prince Hal returned at once. With tears in his eyes he knelt beside his father's bed. "I never thought to hear you speak again," he said. And the king replied sadly, "Thy wish was father, Henry, to that thought. I stay too long by thee, I weary thee. Dost thou so hunger for my empty chair that thou wilt needs invest thee with mine honours before thy hour is ripe? O foolish youth, thou seek'st the greatness that will overwhelm thee." "Oh, pardon me, my liege," said Prince Hal, weeping, and the king pardoned and blessed him before he died. "How I came by the crown, O God forgive, and grant it may with thee in true peace live." End of chapter 52. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on July 13th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 53. Henry V. of Monmouth. The story of the Battle of Agincourt. When Prince Hal came to the throne in 1413 A.D., he gave up all his wild ways, and tried to rule as a wise king should. Judge Gascoigne was very much afraid that he would suffer now for having sent the prince to prison, but Henry had a noble mind. He knew that the judge had only done what was right. So after he became king, Henry treated Judge Gascoigne as a friend, and when he gave up his judgeship it was because he was a very old man. "Still be my judge," he said, "and if I should ever have a son who does wrong, I hope you will punish him as you did me. Therefore still bear the balance and the sword, and I do wish your honours may increase, till you do live to see a son of mine offend you and obey you as I did. So shall I live to speak my father's words. Happy am I that have a man so bold that dares do justice on my proper son, and no less happy, having such a son that would deliver up his greatness so into the hands of justice." Henry came peacefully to the throne, but he had no better right to it than his father had. There were many people who could not forget that, and it was not long before plots were formed. But Henry put down these plots, and then he thought of fighting with France. You remember how Edward III had claimed to be King of France as well as King of England, and how he did indeed conquer a great part of France. But at the end of his reign, and during the reigns of Richard II and Henry IV, all that he had conquered had again been lost. Of the many French lands which had at one time belonged to England, only the town of Calais remained. Henry V made up his mind to try to win back these lands. He thought that if the plots against him became too strong, and he were driven from the throne of England, he could then still be King of France. The eldest son of the King of France was called the Dauphin, just as the eldest son of the King of England is always called the Prince of Wales. At this time the King of France was mad, so the Dauphin ruled. When he heard that Henry V was coming to fight against him, he sent a present of some tennis balls. "Tell the English king," he said to his messenger, "that he is too young and foolish to claim dukedoms here. It will be better for him to amuse himself at home with these balls." Henry laughed when he received the present, and sent back this message: "And tell the pleasant prince this mock of his hath turned his balls to gunstones." Henry gathered his army, and, landing in France, laid siege to the town of Harfleur. The town held out bravely for a long time, and, when at last it fell, the English army was so worn out, so many of them had been killed and wounded, that they were not strong enough to fight any more. Yet Henry did not want to return to England, having only taken one French town. He resolved to march from Harfleur to Calais, and sail home from there. He would show the French that the English were not afraid of them. So the army left Harfleur, and day after day, ragged, hungry, and worn, they marched along the weary way towards Calais. Day after day passed, but no French soldiers ever came in sight till one evening, when they had gone about half the long journey, the enemy appeared. Even then, weary and worn though the English were, the French did not think themselves strong enough to attack, and fell back before them. But about 40 miles from Calais, Henry found the French army right across his path. If Calais was to be reached, the French must be beaten, and Calais had to be reached, as it was the only way home, and Henry's men were utterly weary and almost starving. On the morning of the battle, Henry rode along the lines, cheering his poor tired soldiers. He had a gold crown upon his helmet, and the coat which he wore over his armor was embroidered with the leopards of England and the lilies of France, for already he called himself King of France and England. As Henry rode along, he heard one of his nobles say, "I would that some of the thousands of warriors who lie idle this day in England were here to aid us." "Nay," replied the king, "I would not have one man more. If we win, the greater is the glory God gives to us. If we die, the less is the loss to England." When Henry had ridden all along the lines, he got off his horse and took his place among his soldiers, with the royal standard waving over him. The fight began, and a terrible fight it was. It seemed as if it were the story of Crécy and Poitiers all over again. The French had an army 10 times greater than that of the English. Many of the English, too, were sick and ill, weary, ragged, and half-fed, and yet they won the battle. When it was over, Henry, riding across the field, met one of the French heralds. "To whom does the victory belong?" he asked. "To you, sire," replied the man. "Nay," said the king, "but to God. We English made not this great slaughter. What fortress is that?" he added, "for it is fitting that the battle should have a name." "That is the castle of Agincourt, sire," replied the herald. "Then Agincourt shall this battle be called," said Henry, "and by that name we know it." This was one of the greatest battles ever fought between the French and English, but although the English won, the army was too worn out to do more, and so they went home to England. But Henry soon gathered another army and returned to France. There was more fighting, till at last, 5 years later, peace was made, and Henry married Catherine, the daughter of the French king. It was arranged that King Charles, who, you remember, was mad, should keep the title of king while he lived, but that Henry should rule, and that when Charles died, Henry should be king of France. But about 2 years after this, Henry himself died. He was only 34, and had reigned but 10 years. He was a wise king and ruled well, yet his great battles are what we hear most of in his reign, and they brought suffering and sorrow to many of his people. Still his people loved him, and their grief at his death was great. Henry V, too famous to live long. England ne'er lost a king of so much worth. England ne'er had a king until his time. Virtue he had deserving to command, his brandished sword did blind men with his beams, his arms spread wider than a dragon's wings. His sparkling eyes, replete with wrathful fire, more dazzled and drove back his enemies than midday sun, fierce bent against their faces. What should I say? His deeds exceed all speech. He ne'er lift up his hand, but conquered. End of chapter 53. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on July 13th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 54. Henry IV of Windsor. The Story of the Maid of Orleans. When Henry V died in 1422 A.D., his son, who was also called Henry, was only a tiny baby 9 months old. Yet the people had loved Henry V so much that they chose that this tiny baby should be called their king. Of course, a baby 9 months old, who could not even speak, could not rule, so his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, ruled instead. Queen Catherine, the baby's mother, married a Welsh gentleman called Owen Tudor, and took no part in ruling the kingdom. For a little time things seemed to go well, but soon troubles began. Charles, the mad King of France, died about 2 months after the death of Henry V, and the baby Henry VI was proclaimed King of France in his place. "May God grant long life to Henry, by the grace of God, King of France and England," cried the heralds. But the Dauphin, Charles, felt that he was the rightful heir, and he too called himself King of France. The baby king, of course, did not know anything about what was happening, but his uncle John, Duke of Bedford, who ruled France for him, was very angry with the Dauphin, and began to fight with him. The English were so strong that at first they defeated the French armies, and the Dauphin was in despair. The Scots had been helping the French. To stop them doing so, the English said that they would set their king free if they would promise not to help the French any more. You remember that King James, when he was a little boy, had been taken prisoner by Henry IV, and he had now been in prison for 19 years. While in prison, James had seen a beautiful lady from his window as she walked in the garden of the palace. He loved her, although he had never spoken to her nor heard her speak. James was a poet as well as a king, and he wrote some beautiful poetry about her. "And therewith cast I down my eyes again, where as I walking saw beneath the tower full secretly, new coming to her play, the fairest and the freshest young flower that ever I saw, methought, before that hour. For which sudden surprise anon did start the blood of all my body to my heart. And when she walked had a little time, under the sweet green branches bent, her fair, fresh face, as white as any snow, she turned it has, and forth her way she went. But then began my sickness and torment, to see her go, and follow not I might. Methought the day was turned into night. Bewailing in my chamber thus alone, despairing of all joy and remedy, oft weary of my thoughts and woe begone, unto the window would I walk in haste to see the world and the folk who went forby. As for the time, though I of mirth's food might have no more, to look it did me good." As soon as James was free, he married this beautiful lady and went back to Scotland with her. But before he went, the English made him pay a large sum of money in return for all that had been spent on him while he was in prison. He also promised not to help the French in their battles with the English. So this is why the Scots could no longer fight for the French. But other help came to them. They found a great leader who brought them victory. This great leader was a woman. In a peaceful little village, far away from the sounds of war, lived a peasant girl called Jeanne d'Arc, or as we call her in English, Joan of Arc. She had never been to school. She could neither read nor write. Ever since she had been quite a little girl, she had had to work hard all day long in the fields and in the house. But although she was ignorant, Joan was gentle and good, and her heart was full of love for her country. From time to time, stories of battle and loss and death were brought to the little village by sick and wounded soldiers from the battlefields. As Joan listened to these stories, tears filled her eyes, and a great longing grew in her heart to do something for her dear country. She spent long days alone in the fields taking care of her master's sheep. While she watched the sheep, she kept thinking and longing. "What can I do?" she said to herself. "I am only a poor, ignorant girl. What can I do for my country?" At last it seemed to her as if the empty air around her was full of voices, which answered her question. It seemed to her that saints and angels came to her, and whispered that she was chosen to free France. "Put on the courage and the armor of a man," said the voices, "and lead the armies to victory." When Joan told people that God had chosen her as captain, they thought at first that she was mad, but she was so earnest and so sure that at last they took her to the Dauphin. Dressed like a man in shining white armor, riding upon a beautiful white horse and carrying a white banner sewed with the gold lilies of France, she looked so beautiful and so good that the Dauphin and the soldiers could not but believe in her. So this peasant girl, who knew nothing of war, who had never before worn armor, nor carried a sword, nor ridden upon a horse, took command of the army. The rough soldiers honored, obeyed, and almost worshipped her. New hope sprang up in their hearts, new strength to fight. So full of courage were they now, that in less than a week fortune changed. The English began to lose, and the French to win. Joan's first fighting was at Orleans, which had been besieged by the English for some months. Joan beat the English and drove them away, and because of that she was afterwards often called the Maid of Orleans. Battle after battle was fought, town after town was taken from the English, until about 2 months from the time Joan began to fight, the French were so completely victorious that the Dauphin was crowned at Rheims. It was a very splendid sight. The church was crowded with knights and nobles and rejoicing people, but no one rejoiced more than the Maid of Orleans. Dressed still in her beautiful white armor, holding her white banner in her hand, she stood beside the Dauphin as the crown was placed upon his head, and he was proclaimed King of France, instead of the little English King Henry VI. Then, when all was over, Joan begged to be allowed to go home again, to tend sheep once more, and to be with her brothers and her sisters. "They would be so glad to see me," she said. "My work here is done." But the king would not let her go. The English still remained in the country, and fighting still went on, so Joan, as she was not allowed to go home, went on fighting too. But one sad day, during a battle, she was wounded, and taken prisoner by the English. The English were very glad of this, because they thought that she was a witch. In those days people still believed in witches, and were very much afraid of them. The English thought that no one who was not a witch could have done the wonderful things Joan had done. After being kept in prison for nearly a year, Joan, young, beautiful, and good though she was burned as a witch, because she had freed her country. The English did not do this wicked deed, but, what was almost as bad, they allowed their friends, the Burgundians, who were French, but who had been fighting on the English side, to do it. After this the English proclaimed Henry VI King of France at Paris, but it was only an empty show, for he was not really King of France. Fighting still went on, but the English lost more and more, till at last they had lost all the lands they had ever held in France. In 1451 A.D. only the town of Calais remained to them, and the 100 Years' War, begun by Edward III in 1340 A.D., came to an end. While these things were happening in France, the baby King of England was growing up to be a man. And a very weak man he grew to be. He was pulled this way and that among his many advisers who ruled the country and quarrelled among themselves. The lords made the king marry a French lady called Margaret of Anjou. She was very strong-willed, and it was really she, more than King Henry, who ruled. The country was in a very unhappy state. The long wars with France had cost a great deal of money and a great many lives. The people were heavily taxed in order to pay for the wars. The men who were taken away for soldiers very often never came home again. There were not enough people in the country to do the work, and famine and disease and all kinds of misery followed. At last the people rebelled, just as they had rebelled in the time of Richard II, under Wat Tyler. This time their leader was called Jack Cade. It all happened very much as before. The rebels marched to London and camped upon Blackheath. A battle was fought in which the king's men were defeated. Then Jack Cade and his followers were promised what they asked. Many of them afterwards went home quietly, but Jack Cade himself was killed. This rising lasted only a few weeks, but another struggle which lasted 30 years soon began. This struggle was called The Wars of the Roses. End of chapter 54. This is the end of the first half of Our Island Story by H.E. Marshall. To listen to the second half, please visit the catalog page at LibriVox.org. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on July 13th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 55. Henry VI of Windsor, the Red Rose and the White. You remember that Henry IV, who took the crown from Richard II, was descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the fourth son of Edward III. But there was someone who had a better right to the throne. That was Edmund Mortimer, who was descended from the third son of Edward III. Now, in the time of Henry VI, there was still living a descendant of Edmund Mortimer. He was called Richard, Duke of York. The Wars of the Roses began because Richard claimed to be the rightful heir to the throne. At first Richard said he only wanted to be made protector of the kingdom, because he saw how weak and easily led the king was. It seemed, indeed, as if the king needed a protector, for he was not only weak and foolish, but at times he was quite mad, and unable even to speak for days. The Duke of York hoped that if he was protector during Henry's life, the people would make him king after Henry died. The people would very likely have agreed to this had not a little son been born to Henry. This little son was called Edward, and many of the nobles turned from the Duke of York for his sake. Although Henry was quite unfit to rule, they hoped that his little son would grow up wise and good, and more like his grandfather, Henry V. So some of the nobles sided with the Duke of York, and others with the king, and the quarreling between them became very bad. Many at first were afraid to speak out and say openly on which side they were, but soon the quarrel grew to be so bitter that not only the nobles but the whole nation took sides. One day, while walking in the Temple Gardens in London with some other nobles, Richard, Duke of York, tried to persuade them to join his cause. "Ah," he said at last, "I see you are afraid to speak out. Well then, give me a sign to show on whose side you are. Let him that is a true-born gentleman, and stands upon the honor of his birth, if he supposes that I have pleaded truth, from off this briar pluck a white rose with me." Saying that, he pulled a white rose which grew on a bush near, and stuck it in his cap. Then the Duke of Somerset sprang forward, and, tearing a red rose from another bush, said, "Let him that is no coward nor no flatterer, but dare maintain the party of the truth, pluck a red rose from off the thorn with me." Then one after another all the nobles who were there plucked red or white roses. Those who were for Lancaster, that is, the king, because he was descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, wore red roses in their caps. Those who were for the Duke of York wore white roses in theirs. And ever after, during all the years that the wars lasted, red and white roses were the sign or badge of the two parties, and the wars were called the Wars of the Roses. The first battle was fought at St. Albans in 1455 A.D. The White Rose won this battle, and King Henry was taken prisoner. The Duke of York treated Henry very kindly, and as he became quite mad for a time, the Duke ruled the country. The next year, however, the king recovered from his madness. He sent the Duke away, and once more ruled the kingdom himself, or rather it was the Queen who ruled, for she was very fond of power, but did not care in the least to do what was best for the people. So she was greatly hated, and it was not long before war again broke out. This time, too, the White Rose was successful. Queen Margaret fled to Scotland with her little son, and Henry was again taken prisoner. The Duke of York now claimed the throne in earnest. He entered London in great state. Trumpets were sounded, the sword of office was carried before him, and he was followed and surrounded by a train of soldiers and servants. He rode straight to Westminster, where Parliament was sitting, and did not pause until he reached the House of Lords. There he marched up to the throne and laid his hand upon the cloth of state with which it was covered, as if he meant to show that he had taken possession of it. But he did not sit on the throne. He stood for some time in silence, looking at the empty seat, keeping his hand still upon the cloth. Then turning, he looked at the nobles as they crowded before him. Still silent, he stood wondering, and as if asking himself, "Are they glad or sorry to see me?" Then in the silence the Archbishop of Canterbury stepped forward. "My Lord Duke," he said, "will you come to see the king?" The Duke of York drew himself up proudly. "I cannot remember, my Lord Archbishop," he said, "that there is any one in this kingdom who should not rather come to me than I go to him." Then he turned, and boldly sat upon the throne. Sitting there, the Duke made a long speech to the lords. He reminded them that Henry IV had taken the crown by force, and tried to show that he, the Duke of York, had a better right to the throne than Henry VI. "Therefore," he said, "according to my just and free title, I have and do take possession of this royal throne, and, with God's help, I shall keep it for his glory, my own honor, and the good of all my people." When the Duke had finished, there was a deep silence. The lords sat as if struck dumb. In their astonishment, they seemed afraid even to whisper or utter one word. "It is good," said the Duke at last, "that you should think well of what I have said." And rising, he went away, not very pleased at their silence, yet not quite displeased either. He went to the royal palace, took possession of Henry's own rooms, and lived there more like a king than a duke. Left to themselves, the lords and the commons, after a great deal of talking, decided that while Henry lived he should still be called king, but that the Duke of York should be protector, and that when Henry died the Duke should be the next king. Henry, who was weak and idle, was quite satisfied with this. So was the Duke, for he was a wise man who really loved his country. He meant to rule well, and hoped in this way to become king without further fighting. But Queen Margaret was very angry. She loved to rule, and she hated the Duke of York, and she would not be ruled by him, nor have her son set aside for him. She came from Scotland, where she had been hiding with her little boy, and gathering an army, fought another battle with the Duke of York and his followers. It was a terrible battle. This time the Red Rose won, and the Duke of York himself was taken prisoner. After the battle was over, the Red Rose soldiers set the Duke on a little mound. They crowned him with bulrushes, and then knelt before him, crying, "Hail, King without rule! Hail, King without heritage! Hail, Duke and Prince without people or possessions!" And after this cruel mocking of a helpless prisoner, they cut off his head. The wicked Queen Margaret laughed with joy when she saw it, and, to mock the dead man still further, she placed a paper crown upon the head and stuck it upon the walls of York. One of the Duke's sons, a pretty boy of only 12, was killed too. He was trying to run away with his tutor when he was caught by one of the Red Rose soldiers. "Oh, please, please do not kill me," sobbed the boy, the tears running down his cheeks. "I do not want to die." But the soldier had a cruel heart and would not listen. Dumb with fear, the poor little boy fell upon his knees, holding up his hands to beg for mercy. But the soldier had no mercy. "Your father killed mine," he cried. "I will kill you." So the poor little boy died. Queen Margaret had no mercy either. She seemed mad with revenge. She killed as many of the White Rose nobles as she could, and the White Rose cause seemed lost. But although Richard, Duke of York, was dead, he had a son called Edward, who now became Duke, and the head of the White Rose party, and more terrible battles were fought. The people hated the queen for her cruelty and her wickedness. She had no money with which to pay her soldiers, so she allowed them to plunder, and they too were hated and feared wherever they went. The gates of London were closed against them, the people refusing to give them even the plainest food. But Edward of York was young, brave, and handsome, and when he came to London with his army, the people threw open the gates to him, welcoming him as their king. Then the Bishop of Exeter, standing up among the great crowds who had gathered to meet him, reminded the people of all the cruel wrongs which they had suffered during Henry's reign. "Will you have him still to rule over you?" he asked. "No, no," shouted the people. "No, no." "If you will not have Henry, whom will you have?" asked the bishop. "Will you serve, love, honor, and obey Edward, Earl of March and Duke of York, as your only king and sovereign lord?" "Yes, yes," shouted the people. "King Edward! King Edward! Long live King Edward!" So, with shouting and cheering and clapping of hands, the people chose Edward of York to be their king. End of chapter 55. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on July 13th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Chapter 56. Edward IV, the story of Queen Margaret and the robbers. It was in 1461 AD that the people chose Edward IV as their king. And so there were two kings in England, Henry VI, the head of the Red Rose, and Edward IV, the head of the White Rose party. There could be no peace in the country so long as there were two kings, each claiming the throne. So, without waiting to be crowned, Edward marched to meet the Red Rose army and to fight for the crown. On a bleak day in March, the two forces met at Towton in Yorkshire and fought amid a wild storm of wind and snow. For 10 hours the battle raged. The white snow was stained, and the river which flowed near ran red with blood, till it seemed as if the earth and the sky had taken sides with the red and white roses. Never since Hastings had such a terrible battle been fought on English ground. The White Rose was victorious. Henry's cause seemed utterly lost, and he and his wife and their little son fled to Scotland. If Henry had been left to himself, he would have given up fighting for the crown, for he loved quiet and peace. But Queen Margaret loved power, and would not rest until she had again won the kingdom. She got help from the French king, and in 3 years was back in England once more. But Edward and the great Earl of Warwick, who had helped to put Edward upon the throne, were too strong for Margaret, and she was utterly defeated. Without a single friend or servant, Margaret and her little son, who was now about 11 years old, fled into the forest to hide. The night came on, it grew dark, and they lost their way among the winding paths. Hungry and tired, they did not know which way to turn. Afraid to stop, afraid to go on, starting and shrinking at every sound, they clung to each other trembling. Presently they heard men's voices and saw the glimmer of a fire. Margaret whispered to her little son to be very still, as they crept near to find out who these people were, whether friends or enemies. Hidden by the trees, the Queen and her little boy came quite close to the fire, and stood listening and watching. In a few minutes they found out that these men were robbers. Holding the prince tight by the hand, Queen Margaret made ready to run away. But suddenly one of the robbers looked toward them. He saw the glitter of jewels in the firelight. With a cry he made a spring at the Queen, and in spite of her screams and struggles, she was dragged into the circle round the fire. "Aha! What have we here?" cried one robber. "A fine prize, truly," said another. "Here is gold enough," said a third, roughly pulling at the chain round Margaret's neck. "Come, lady, we will have all these things," he went on, pointing to her jewels. The queen began to take off her rings and jewels, for she was very much afraid. But one robber pushed the other aside. "Let be," he said, "the prize is mine. I took her." "Nay, nay, share and share alike. It is mine, I say. I took her, I say. It is mine." So the robbers began to quarrel fiercely about the treasure, and while they quarrelled, Margaret took the prince in her arms and ran away. Where she ran she did not know. On and on she went, stumbling through the dark forest. At last, breathless and weary, unable to go another step, she sank down on a grassy bank. Scarcely had she done so when another robber appeared. Seeing no escape, Margaret went towards this robber, putting the little prince into his arms. "Friend," she says, "take care of him. He is the son of your true king." The hard, rough man, accustomed only to murder and rob, felt sorry for the poor tired lady and her little boy. He held the prince in his arms, saying, "Lady, I will not hurt you. Come with me, and I will show you where you can rest safely." The robber led the queen and prince through the forest till he came to his secret cave. There he fed them and kept them safe for some days, and at last took them to the shore, where they found a ship in which to sail over the sea. But King Henry was not so fortunate. He escaped and hid in various places for nearly a year, but he was discovered at last and taken prisoner to London. As he rode a prisoner into the city, he was met by the Earl of Warwick, and the poor unfortunate king was made to ride through the streets like a common criminal, with his feet tied under his horse. Then he was shut up in the Tower of London. End of chapter 56.
Chapter 57. Edward the Fourth. The Story of the King-Maker. Edward the Fourth now felt quite sure of the throne, and he married secretly a beautiful lady called Elizabeth Woodville. When this marriage became known, the Earl of Warwick was very angry, because he thought the king should have married someone more great and powerful. The Earl of Warwick himself was so great and powerful that he was called the King-Maker, and he had done much to make Edward king. Edward soon acted in many ways which displeased the Earl, and they quarrelled, and plots were formed to drive Edward from the throne. Among the people who plotted against him was the Duke of Clarence, King Edward's own brother. At last the Earl of Warwick became so angry with Edward that he took him prisoner, and shut him up in a castle called Middleham. So there were 2 kings in England, both of them prisoners. The King-Maker, having made and unmade the king, now ruled the country himself for a year. He really had intended to make the Duke of Clarence king, but he found that even he was not powerful enough to do that. In about a year's time, Warwick set Edward free again, and, strange to say, they made up their quarrels, and were friends once more. But in a very short time they again quarrelled, so badly this time that the Earl of Warwick, who had fought so hard for the White Rose of York, forsook it, and joined the Red Rose of Lancaster. He went to France, where Margaret and her son were, and offered to help them to conquer England, and place Henry again on the throne. So one morning Edward awoke to hear the Red Rose war cry, and 2 friends, running into his room, begged him to fly. "For," they said, "even in your own army we know not who is true and who is false, many like Warwick having turned traitor." Hardly waiting to dress, without money or armor, Edward threw himself upon his horse and rode as fast as possible to the coast. There he found some ships, and with a few friends and 200 or 300 faithful soldiers, he sailed over to Holland. They were very poor, had no money nor goods, nor indeed anything except the clothes they wore. Edward, who had one day been King of England, Wales, and Ireland, found himself the next a homeless, penniless wanderer. And Warwick, in little more than a week, had deposed the king whom he had helped to set on the throne, and had placed Henry VI once more there. Henry was brought out of prison and dressed in beautiful robes, and, riding upon a splendid horse, was led through the town, while the people cheered and shouted, "God save the King! Long live King Harry!" Did he remember that the last time he rode through the same streets it had been as a wretched prisoner, bound and disgraced by the very man who now set him again on the throne? And did he remember that the people, who now cheered, had then cursed and laughed at him? Although Henry was once more on the throne, he could not rule. He was like a wooden doll in the hands of a clever man such as the Earl of Warwick, and it was the Earl and the Duke of Clarence who ruled. Henry would have been far happier had he been left alone to his books and prayers. He loved peace, yet he was made the cause of war by the proud and powerful men and women around him. Edward had been obliged to fly from the country, penniless and almost friendless, yet he did not despair. He persuaded the Duke of Burgundy to help him, and soon returned to England with an army. No sooner had he landed than people began to flock to him. By the time he reached Barnet, near London, he had a large army. Many who had joined Warwick now forsook him and returned to Edward, among them Edward's own brother, the Duke of Clarence, who brought 12,000 men with him. There seemed to be no faith nor loyalty in those days. It was hard to know who was friend and who was foe. At Barnet, on Easter Day, 14th of April, 1471 A.D., another terrible battle was fought. What made it more terrible was that it was begun and ended in a thick mist. In the white dimness which wrapped both armies, it was difficult to know the red roses from the white, and indeed at one time the red roses fought against themselves. King Edward's men wore a golden sun embroidered upon their coats. The Duke of Oxford's men, who were fighting for King Henry, wore a golden star. In the midst, the red rose soldiers, mistaking the star for the sun, attacked the Duke of Oxford's men, thinking that they were King Edward's men, and killed many of them. From dawn to midday the battle raged. Then the Earl of Warwick's army broke and fled, leaving the White Rose victorious. The great king-maker was found dead upon the field, and Edward IV was once more king. On the very day of this battle, Queen Margaret and her son, who was now about 18, landed in England. They had hoped to find Warwick victorious and Henry on the throne. Instead, they found Warwick dead, his army shattered, and Edward on the throne. But Margaret was as bold as ever. She marched through England, gathering soldiers as she went, and at Tewkesbury another great battle was fought. Here again the Red Rose was utterly defeated, and Margaret and her son were taken prisoner. Prince Edward was led before King Edward. The king looked fiercely at the young and handsome prince. He hated him more than he had ever hated his poor, weak, gentle father. "How dare you come into my kingdom to stir up my people to rebellion?" he asked. "It is not your kingdom, but my father's," replied Prince Edward proudly. "You are a traitor. I should sit where you are. You should stand before me as a subject." Then King Edward, pale with rage and hate, struck the boy in the face with his steel-gloved hand. The Dukes of Clarence and Gloucester, the king's brothers, dragged the prince away and stabbed him to death. Queen Margaret was put in prison, and a few days later King Henry died mysteriously in the Tower of London. Many people thought that he was murdered by King Edward's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. At last it seemed as if all Edward's enemies were either dead or in prison, and that he might really rule in peace. The Red Rose party was for the time utterly crushed. Some of the great nobles even were seen barefoot in rags, begging for bread from door to door. Edward never quite forgave his brother, the Duke of Clarence, for having at one time sided with Warwick. Clarence, too, was jealous of the Queen Elizabeth and her relatives, many of whom had the chief posts at court, so he quarrelled with them and with his brother the king. At last an old wizard prophesied that someone whose name began with G would bring about the death of King Edward and the ruin of his house. The Duke of Clarence was called George, and King Edward made the prophecy an excuse for shutting him up in the Tower. He never came out again. It is supposed that he was murdered, some say by being drowned in a cask of wine by the order of his brother, the Duke of Gloucester. Edward IV died in 1483 A.D. He was brave, but cruel and revengeful, handsome but wicked, caring little for the happiness of his people, and his reign was dark with many battles and murders. He had ruled for 22 years, during 12 of which King Henry still lived. End of chapter 57. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on July 13th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Chapter 58. Edward V, the story of the king who was never crowned. When Edward IV died, his eldest son was only 13, but the people willingly chose him to be king. The young Prince of Wales, now Edward V, was living at Ludlow Castle with his uncle, Lord Rivers. When the news of his father's death was brought to him, he at once set out for London, accompanied by his uncle and some gentlemen. On the way, he was met by another uncle, Richard of Gloucester, who was a wicked, hard-hearted man. He sent Lord Rivers and his friends to prison, and himself took charge of the young king. Edward was very fond of Lord Rivers, and was afraid of his ugly uncle Richard. He cried when Lord Rivers and his friends were taken away from him. That did no good, but the poor little king was only a boy, and he did not know what else to do. When the queen heard of what happened, she was so frightened that she ran away from the palace in which she had been living, taking her daughters and her other little son, who was called Richard, with her. She ran to Westminster Abbey, and there took sanctuary, as Hubert de Burgh did, you remember, many years before, in the days of Henry III. The Duke of Gloucester had the young king in his power, but he was not satisfied with that. He wanted to have Prince Richard too. Queen Elizabeth, however, would not give up her little boy, who was only 10 years old, and the Duke of Gloucester, bad though he was afraid to take him by force, because he was still trying to pretend to be a good, kind uncle to the little boys. At last, the Duke sent a bishop to the Queen to try to persuade her to give up her little son. The bishop said everything he could think of to make her do so, but all in vain. "My little boy has been ill," said the Queen. "He is not well enough yet to leave his mother." "Ah, lady," said the bishop, "it is not kind to his brother the king to keep him here. They should be together, so that they could play with each other." "Oh, surely some other little boy could play with the king," said the Queen. "Little boys, even if they are kings, do not ask that their playmates should be princes. I will not let my little boy go." "Let him but come to me, and I will guard his life as my own," said the bishop. At these words, the Queen stood for a long time thinking silently. It seemed to her as if she must give up her boy sooner or later. It would be better to give him to the kind bishop, who would perhaps keep him safe, than to his wicked uncle. So, taking the prince by the hand, she led him to the bishop. "I know you are faithful and true," she said. "You are strong and powerful too, and oh, for the trust his father put in you, I now charge you, guard my boy." Then, kneeling beside her little son, and putting her arms round him, she held him close to her heart. "Farewell, my own sweet son," she said. "God give you good keeping. Let me kiss you yet once before you go, for God knows when we shall kiss together again." Then she kissed him, and blessed him, and kissed him again, and again, and at last, crying bitterly, put him into the arms of the bishop, and turned her face from him. But weeping as bitterly, little Richard clung to her, and would not go,
until the bishop, taking him strongly in his arms, carried him away. The bishop led the prince straight to his uncle, who was very glad to see him. His ugly face shone with joy as he took his nephew in his arms and kissed him. "Now welcome, my lord," he said. "With all my heart you are right welcome." King Edward, too, was very pleased to see his brother, for they had been parted for a long time. The Duke led them through the streets with great pomp, and put them into the Tower. Now that the Duke of Gloucester had both the princes in his power, he began to show his wickedness. He sent to the prison in which Lord Rivers and his friends were imprisoned, and ordered their heads to be cut off, because he knew that they were the Queen's friends. Then he called a council to arrange, he said, about the coronation. Only a very few lords were asked to this council. When they were all gathered together, he came into the room, seemingly very much disturbed. "What should be done to people who try to murder me?" he asked. At first, every one was so astonished that no one spoke. Then Lord Hastings, who was a brave man and true to the king and the Queen, his mother, said, "If anyone has tried, he deserves to be punished, whoever he is." "The Queen has tried with her sorcery," cried the Duke, "and others have helped her." And pulling up his sleeve, he showed his arm, which was all puckered and withered. In those days it was believed that people had power to hurt their enemies by saying wicked words and rhymes and wishing evil to them. It was thought that people could even kill others who were quite far away, and who they could not even see nor touch. This was called sorcery. Of course it was a very foolish belief, and everyone knew that the Duke of Gloucester's arm had always been withered up. But when he said that the Queen had done it by sorcery, no one dared to contradict him. There was silence in the hall, till Lord Hastings said, "If the Queen has done this—" "You answer me with ifs and ands," cried the Duke. "You are a traitor, I say," and with that he struck his hand upon the table. Immediately soldiers rushed into the room. "Seize him," he said, pointing to Lord Hastings. "Cut off his head." "My lord," said Hastings, "I am no traitor." "You are a traitor," yelled the Duke, "and by heaven I will not dine till I see your head cut from your body. Obey your orders," he added, turning to the soldiers. Lord Hastings was hurried away, and without being allowed to defend himself, without a trial of any kind, he was made to lay his neck upon a rough plank of wood, which happened to be at hand, and his head was at once cut off. So another of the king's friends was dead. The Duke of Gloucester next made a clergyman called Shaw preach to the people and tell that the little princes were not really the sons of King Edward IV and his Queen, and that therefore they had no right to the throne of England. "Our true king," said this wicked clergyman, "is Richard, Duke of Gloucester." Then he waited, expecting every one to cry out, "King Richard! King Richard!" but there was not a sound. The people stood as if they had been turned into stone. Pale and trembling they went away to their homes, wondering what would happen next. The clergyman too went home. He was so ashamed to have preached such a wicked sermon that he never again showed himself to the people, and died soon after. The Duke of Gloucester was very angry and disappointed when he heard of the bad success of his wicked plans, but he did not give them up. He again gathered a lot of people together, and this time his friend the Duke of Buckingham talked to them. The Duke of Buckingham said much the same things as the clergyman had said. When the people heard these wicked lies for the second time, they began to whisper among themselves, till it seemed as if a swarm of buzzing bees filled the hall, but not a single person shouted "King Richard." And then some of the Duke's servants and friends came into the hall, and they shouted, "King Richard! King Richard! Long live King Richard!" But the cries sounded very feeble, for they came from only a few. The Duke of Buckingham, however, pretended that all the people had shouted for King Richard. He thanked them, and he and his friends went to the Duke of Gloucester, and told him that the people had chosen him as their king, and were cheering and shouting for King Richard. Richard then pretended to be very unwilling to take the crown, and only consented to do so after a great deal of persuasion. This was all a part of his wickedness and cunning. Richard was crowned with much splendour and grandeur, and poor little King Edward, who had never been crowned at all, and who had only been called king for a few weeks, was kept shut up in the Tower of London. End of chapter 58.
Chapter 59. Richard III. The Story of the Two Little Princes in the Tower. When Edward was told what his uncle had done, he was very sad and very much afraid. "Oh," he said, "I hope my uncle will not take my life as he has taken my kingdom." From that day he became sorrowful, and did not seem to care about anything. He did not even trouble to dress himself properly. Richard took away all the little prince's servants, and left them only one man called Black Bill. He was rough and rude, but even he loved the gentle little boys and tried to comfort them, for, shut up in one room with nothing to do, the days seemed very long and dreary. But although Richard was king, he could not be happy. He could not forget the little princes in the tower. As long as they lived, he knew that some day the people might drag him from the throne and make one of them king instead. So he determined to kill Edward and his brother. King Richard sent a message to the governor of the tower telling him to kill the princes, but the governor refused to do the wicked deed. Richard, however, could always find men bad enough to do what he wanted. He sent a bad man now to the governor of the tower, commanding him to give up the keys of the tower for one night. The governor was forced to obey the king, but he did so with a sad heart. That night the little princes went to sleep with their arms round each other's necks, each trying to comfort the other. They lay together in a great big bed, happy in their dreams, with tears still wet upon their cheeks. As they slept, two men crept softly, softly up the dark stair. Quietly they opened the door and stole into the room. They stood beside the bed, hardly daring to look at the two pretty children, in case the sight might soften even their hard hearts, and they would be unable to do the cruel deed. Then they seized the clothes and the pillows and pressed them over the faces of the little boys. They could not scream, they could not breathe. Soon they lay still, smothered in their sleep. Then these wicked men took the bodies of the two little princes and threw them into a hole which they had made under the staircase, covered them over, and fled away. There the bodies were found many years later. Now that Richard had murdered the rightful king and his brother, he was no happier. Terrible dreams came to him at night, so that he could not sleep. By day he thought that people were ever ready to kill him, and his hand was almost always on his dagger. The people hated him, and he knew no rest nor peace. He tried to make good laws, so that the people might forget his wickedness, but it was no use. They hated him in spite of all he could do. Plots against Richard soon began. Even the Duke of Buckingham, who had helped him in his wickedness and put him on the throne, turned against him. The people longed for another king, and their thoughts went out to Henry Tudor, Duke of Richmond. You remember that Queen Catherine, the widow of King Henry V, married a Welsh gentleman called Owen Tudor. This Henry Tudor was her grandson, and he was also descended from John of Gaunt. He belonged to the House of Lancaster, and had fought for the Red Rose. Henry of Richmond was at this time living in France, but he now gathered an army and came over to England. But before he came, Richard had already fought the Duke of Buckingham. He defeated him, took him prisoner, and then cut off his head. When Henry heard that, he went away again. But he soon came back. This time, as soon as Henry landed, people flocked to him. Noble after noble deserted Richard and joined the Red Rose party. In 1485 A.D., a great battle was fought, called the Battle of Bosworth Field. This was the last of the Wars of the Roses, and in it King Richard was killed. He fought well, for although he was small and deformed, he could fight. His horse was killed under him, but he still fought on foot. In the middle of the battle, Lord Stanley left the king and, with all his followers, joined Henry Tudor. Seeing that the battle was lost, some of his nobles begged Richard to fly, but he would not. "I will die a king," he said, and so he fell in the thickest of the fight. As he fell, the crown which he had worn over his helmet rolled away under a hawthorn tree. There it was found by Lord Stanley, who set it upon Henry Tudor's head, and, on the battlefield with the dead and dying round, the soldiers shouted, "King Henry! King Henry! Long live King Henry!" The place is still called Crown Hill to this day. Richard III had reigned 2 years, 2 months, and 1 day. "And it was 26 months and 24 hours too long," said a man who lived about that time, and who tells his story. End of chapter 59. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on July 17th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Chapter 60 by H.E. Marshall. Henry VII, the story of the make-believe prince. With Henry Tudor, a new race of kings began to reign in England. For more than 300 years, the kings of England had been Plantagenets. Henry II was the first of the Plantagenets, and he took his name from Geoffrey of Anjou, who used to wear a piece of Plantagenista in his cap. With Richard III, the last of the Plantagenets died, for Henry VII, though a Plantagenet on his mother's side, was a Tudor on his father's side, and it was from his family that Henry took his name. The Tudors were Welsh, and claimed to be descended from the ancient British princes, who, you remember, were driven into Wales when the Saxons took possession of England. The Battle of Bosworth Field was the last of the Wars of the Roses. Henry Tudor, who was the Red Rose Prince, married Elizabeth, the daughter of Edward IV, and sister of the little princes who were murdered in the Tower. She was the White Rose Princess, but by marrying Henry she became the Red Rose Queen, and the differences between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, between the Red Rose and the White, ought to have been quite forgotten. But Henry himself could not entirely forget these quarrels, which had been so bitter. There were many people in England who still belonged to the White Rose party. Although they had hated Richard, they were not pleased to see a Red Rose king upon the throne. So Henry VII was hardly crowned before rebellions against him began. Soon after Henry VII was crowned, a handsome boy and a priest landed in Dublin. This boy called himself the Earl of Warwick. He was, he said, the son of that Duke of Clarence, brother of Edward IV, who was murdered in the Tower by being drowned in a cask of wine. The priest, he said, was his tutor. Ever since the death of his father, the Earl of Warwick had been kept a prisoner. But now, he said, he had escaped in some wonderful manner. The simple Irish people believed this story. They knew nothing of Henry, and had no reason for either hating or loving him. But they did love the House of York, for the Earl of Warwick's grandfather had at one time governed Ireland in the name of the king, and having governed well, the people remembered and loved him. So now they welcomed this young prince with great joy. Edward, Earl of Warwick, as he called himself, was gay and young and handsome, and he gained the love of the Irish so much that they resolved to crown him king. This was done with great rejoicing in Dublin, but they had no crown. So the priest took the golden crown from the statue of the Virgin Mary, which was in the church, and put it upon the boy's head. Then, wearing this crown and dressed in beautiful robes, the new king was carried through the streets on the shoulders of the great strong Irish chieftain, while the people shouted, "Long live King Edward VI." Having been crowned in Ireland, Edward VI thought he would next conquer England. So he sailed the Irish Sea and landed in England with a small army of wild Irishmen and Germans. Meanwhile, Henry VII had heard of these doings in Ireland and had not been idle. He brought the real Earl of Warwick out of the Tower, where he had been kept a prisoner ever since he had been quite a tiny boy. Dressed in fine clothes and riding upon a splendid horse, The real Earl was slowly led through the streets of London, from the Tower to St. Paul's and back again. By another way he was led so that all the people might see him. The young Earl had spent all his life in prison. It must have been quite a wonderful thing for him to come out into the open streets, to see the blue sky, and the houses, and the trees, the great procession of soldiers, and knights in a glittering armour and gorgeous clothes, and the people, men, women, and children, crowding in the streets, all eager to see him. And having been led out, having seen for once all the life and stir of the great city, the poor young prince was taken back again to his dull, quiet prison, while the king marched with his army to fight the pretended Earl. The two armies met at a place called Stoke. Very few English had joined the pretender, for they were quite sure that the Earl whom they had seen riding through the streets of London was the real Earl, and that this one was only a make-believe. The pretender's soldiers were soon defeated, for most of them were wild Irishmen, badly armed and wearing no armour. They were no match for Henry's well-armed and well-trained soldiers. The pretender was taken prisoner, and so was the priest who was with him. They confessed that the prince was no prince at all, but a boy called Lambert Simnel, the son of a baker. The priest, who was a Yorkist or White Rose man, hated Henry, and finding that the boy Lambert was clever as well as handsome, he taught him how to behave as a prince ought. He told him stories of the Duke of Clarence and of Richard III, so that he might pretend to be what he was not. Henry did not kill Lambert Simnel, as many kings who reigned before him would have done. Instead, he gave him a punishment, which had Lambert indeed been a prince, would have been a very dreadful one. He was sent into the king's kitchen to be a scullery boy, and to help the cooks. This boy, who had worn a crown and royal robes, who had been carried through the streets shoulder high while the people cheered him as their king, was a few days later turned into a kitchen drudge, to be ordered about by the cooks, and set to do the meanest kinds of work. But Lambert Simnel behaved himself so well that the king soon took him out of the kitchen and made him a kind of page. He had then to look after the king's falcons. All great people kept falcons in those days. They were used for hunting, and were trained to fly up in the air to catch and kill other birds. A great deal of time and money was spent on falcons. They had hoods of velvet and jewels, and gold and silver chains. Lambert must have found his new work much more pleasant than helping the cooks in the hot kitchens. The priest, who had taught Lambert Simnel, was allowed to go free, but some of the nobles who had helped him were beheaded, and others were made to pay large sums of money. End of chapter 60.